Hello, I'm glad that you're with us. It's time for another study from the book of Philippians. Today we're going to be in chapter 1. We're going to finish out the chapter, actually, verses 27 through 30. Hope you have the New Testament. I hope you have one of our scripture journals still available at the building. You can pick those up on Sunday morning. If you come to worship, you can stop by the office during the week and pick one up as well. Starting to run a little low. We started with about 150 of those, and I would guess our number is below 20 of those left. So a lot of folks have picked those up. Hope those are proving to be useful to you. I'd also encourage you to get the study sheet that is available online on Facebook, on the church's Facebook page. There's a post there about this class and the study sheet, and so you can access that there. Let's begin by reading this last paragraph of Philippians 1. Paul writes, "Only let your manner of life be worthy of the gospel of Christ, so that whether I come and see you or am absent, I may hear of you that you are standing firm in one spirit, with one mind, striving side by side for the faith of the gospel, and not frightened by anything by your opponents. This is a clear sign to them of their destruction, but of your salvation, and that from God. But it has been granted to you that for the sake of Christ you should not only believe in him, but also suffer for his sake, engaged in the same conflict that you saw I had, and now hear that I still have." So as Paul continues his encouragement to these Christians at Philippi, this church that he loves so very dearly, there is a sense in which this paragraph would tie in very well with our study last week, where we looked at verses 12 through 26 of this chapter. And we did that under the title of "The Gospel Gives Meaning." And Paul there, you might recall, was measuring everything by the gospel. He measured his own experience, being in prison, awaiting trial, the possibility of death. He measured that by the gospel. It has actually served, he said, for the advance of the gospel. Then he also, though, measured life and death, his own life and death, by the gospel, and was able then to make that fantastic claim: "For to me to live is Christ, and to die is gain." That can only be said in terms of the gospel. Now we look at this last section, and he begins with this statement: "Only let your manner of life be worthy of the gospel." That is, our present conduct, how we go about living our life today, right now, including, as he's going to mention, any suffering that we're having to face. That itself is measured by the gospel. It is the gospel that gives meaning to all of these things. But let's look at this now, though, and I want you to notice a couple of things with me. I want you to notice that Paul uses some very specific terminology. Paul is very selective in the words that he uses. Only let your manner of life be worthy of the gospel. Here he uses a word that he doesn't use very often. As a matter of fact, there is another term, a much more common term, much more commonly used by Paul just to talk about the way we go about living life. But it's a different word than this word that he uses, because the word that he uses here is a term that literally means to behave as a citizen. As a citizen of a city, and back in these times, in these days, people considered themselves to be citizens of a city, but because they recognized that concept, they understood that concept, that because you were a citizen of a city, then you would act in a certain way. And this was particularly true in regard to the people at Philippi, because Philippi is a Roman colony, and that comes into play. Remember, back in Acts 16, where Luke is recording Paul's visit to Philippi. And during the course of that visit there, he and Silas, they cast out the demon from this girl, this possessed girl who was able to prophesy and whatever. But anyhow, her owners then are extremely upset, and they bring Paul and Silas before the magistrates of the city, and they make this accusation or rather, this description is given in Acts 16, verse 12. It describes Philippi as a leading city of the district of Macedonia and a Roman colony. Luke is specific in identifying Philippi as a Roman colony. There were other cities that had that designation of Roman colony that Paul visited during his tours, his travels, but Philippi is the only one that is called that by Luke. Now, actually, before we go on to that, I want to just make this observation. I think it's the King James version here in verse 27 that uses the phrase conversation. Let your conversation be worthy. Here is an example of one of the challenges in using or with the King James version, since it was produced so long ago. Many of the words that are used in it have actually changed meaning over time. That is, when it was translated, these words meant one thing, and now they tend to mean something else, and that can be misleading for us. As a matter of fact, when we hear the word conversation, what do we think about? Well, we think of our speech. We think about how we talk, our communication with other people. And so we might be led to think, okay, so what Paul is saying here is let the way you talk be worthy of the gospel. Now, that's a good thing. And that is one of many applications that could be made for what Paul is actually saying here. But he is not specifically talking about the way you talk. He is talking about the way you live, generally speaking, specifically with this idea incorporated in it of you are a citizen of this city, therefore you act and you behave in a certain way. Now, let's tie that back into the fact that Philippi is a Roman colony. When a city would receive the designation of a Roman colony in the Roman Empire, there were several things that were true about it. And one of the things simply was the fact that this was a place, this was a town, a community in which these people would live by the standards of the city of Rome. They would speak the language, no matter what the language of the area might be, they would speak the language of Rome, which was Latin. They would organize themselves as a city in line with the way the city of Rome was organized. Even their city officials would receive the designations and titles that were used in Rome. They would practice Roman things. Now, you think about that in terms of the Romans and their expanse of the empire, and one of the genius things about the Roman Empire is that when they would conquer a people, they would not go to great lengths to try to force those people to abandon, their ethnicity, to abandon their customs, to abandon even their way of functioning and operating as far as government and money and all of those kinds of things were concerned. They would allow those people just to continue on in that way. They were only required a couple of things, and that was to be willing to, at least verbally, give their obeisance to Rome, and then also not to cause trouble, just to remain peaceful. And so Rome would allow them just to continue on as they were. And so that tended to promote the peace of the empire. Now, contrasted to that, you have these Roman colonies. These Roman colonies oftentimes were populated very heavily by retired Roman soldiers. That was part of your retirement plan, if you will, is that you serve for so long in the Roman Empire, and then you would be allowed to have citizenship you would be given a place to live in one of these Roman colonies. And so some have described this as a Roman colony was a little colony, a little Rome away from Rome. And so this is the mindset of these people. They are, when Paul and Silas are brought before the magistrates, the people these owners of this girl, they make their accusations against Paul and Silas. They make the very key designation of these men are Jews, and what they're doing and teaching is not acceptable for us to do, being Romans. See, that was how they thought. We are Romans, and that means something. And so Paul is writing to these Christians, and he's trying to encourage them into the kind of behavior and activity that they ought to have as Christians. And so he selects this word that has as its meaning to behave a certain way, being a citizen. These people knew that concept. They lived a certain way, being Romans, Roman citizens. And now Paul is telling them, I want you to behave a certain way because you're a citizen. Now, later in this book, Paul is going to explicitly say this. This is in chapter 3, verse 20, that our citizenship is in heaven. And so he taps into this very powerful idea, particularly for folks at places like Philippi. He says, let your manner of life as a citizen of the kingdom of heaven be worthy of the gospel. And so you're going to live in a way, you're going to behave in a way that aligns itself with the gospel of Christ. And so, again, and still, Paul, the gospel, it permeates everything. It flavors everything about Paul's thinking and what he did and what he was trying to encourage and teach other people. So that whether I come and see you or am absent, I may hear that you are standing firm in one spirit. Okay, so I want you to let that your manner of life be worthy of the gospel. And if that's the case, then Paul says, if I come and see you and witness it with my own eyes, or if I just hear reports about it, these are the things that I'm going to hear. That is, this is what a life worthy of the gospel actually looks like. Number one, you are standing firm. The influences on Christians, the influences on the faith, the influences that are brought to bear on our lives from the world would obviously lead us away from the ways of God. Paul to the Romans, don't be conformed to this world. Literally, don't allow the world to force you into its mold. Don't let it shape you, but you be transformed, Paul told them, by the renewing of your minds. Here, I want you to stand firm against the influences of unrighteousness and wickedness and evil that are in this world. I want you to stand firm. Here again, there's probably a tie-in to this business of being a colony and being populated to a great degree by retired military people, because this is a military term. They actually knew what it meant in hearing the words of Paul to stand firm. It's like a line of soldiers who are taking their stand, and they will not be moved by the force of the enemy and whatever is brought against them. They are going to stand. And that's precisely what we are being called upon to do as well, is that we are going to stand firm. We see some very powerful cultural and societal forces at work in the world today, and it is moving people. It's moving their thinking, it's moving their actions, it's moving their speech. And I'm not suggesting to you that there are not some things being said that need to be said, but where we stand, we have a place that we stand as followers of Jesus Christ. And from that place, we will not be moved. We will stand firm. So that's the first characteristic of a life worthy of the gospel. Behavior worthy of the gospel is that you stand firm. You stand firm, he goes on to say, in one spirit and with one mind. Now, he's going to touch on this idea again here in just a little bit, but there is a uniting, a unity among you that has to be maintained. And it has to do with both your mind and your spirit, about how you think and what you think and your attitude, if you will. These have to be united. You have to have one mind. You see, another thing that we're going to see here in just a few moments is that they are opposed. These Christians are opposed. Paul and Silas, Timothy and Luke were opposed when they were in the city of Philippi. As a matter of fact, Paul has to leave town because of the opposition. And so when he left, it didn't just stop. At Philippi, they just redirected their opposition to those who were followers of Jesus Christ due to the preaching and teaching of Paul. And so these Christians were facing some pretty stiff opposition in Philippi. And you know what happens oftentimes when a group of people comes under attack? That the relationships of those people can become strained. This is a stressful situation. And so things that might otherwise, under more calm and peaceful circumstances, not ever be an issue, can become an issue. We see that in our lives all the time, that under stress, things bother us in ways that they wouldn't normally bother us. So Paul is calling the church at Philippi, that you be careful here, because one of the consequences of what you're undergoing could be to tear you apart. Don't let that happen. You be of one mind and one spirit. Let's go ahead and make an application here. We're living in some stressful times. They just are. And the longer things go on where things are so out of the ordinary for us, the more stressful it becomes to us. And we would be very naive and foolish if we didn't think that those stresses could have a negative impact on the church. There are things that are going on in our world right now, in our nation, in our community, and whatever, that could have the impact of tearing us apart, of dividing us as a church. And I think we need to hear what Paul's saying, and we need to take that to heart, that we are going to make as a priority that we will remain of one mind and one spirit, that we will stick together. Now, we're going to come back to that here in just a moment, because he is going to go on that in one spirit and one mind. Okay, so that's the second thing, that you are striving side by side for the faith of the gospel. You're striving. Now, Paul here uses a term. Again, he's very selective in the language that he uses. He uses another term here that draws upon or comes from another very important realm of cultural life of the first century, not just Philippi, but throughout the Roman Empire, and that had to do with athletic competition. You know, we have been for a long time a sports crazed society. Well, I don't know that we are any more sports crazed than were the Romans. I mean, they were fanatical about it, and the games. We have the Olympics today, which are a direct descendant of the games that were played throughout the Roman Empire, even in the days of Paul. And they weren't just the games of Olympia, Athens, but rather there were games that were held all over in different locations by different names, and these were huge. And so here Paul is this striving side by side. This is a word that comes from that field, that area. It is it is an athletic competition. It is a striving against each other. Well, not against each other, but against an opponent. You should say it that way. And so Paul uses that term. He is a master at touching on these very important and powerful and emotional influences in people's lives, that you are striving side by side for the faith of the gospel. You are striving as a team. You're working as a unit. You are together in this. One of the aspects of our faith as Christians is that, yes, we stand before God ourselves, and we'll give an answer to God for ourselves. I can't answer for you. You can't answer for me. I can't answer for my children or my wife or anybody else. I can only answer for me, and nobody else can answer on my behalf. But at the same time, it has always been God's design that we are a family. We are a community. We are a part of something that is together. Now, this is where one of the influences of American culture has tended to work against what God has put in place, because American culture has always praised and honored the loner. I mean, it is the lone ranger, not a group of rangers, but the lone ranger. It is the Clint Eastwood character in those spaghetti westerns, who was the loner who came into town and he righted wrongs, and he stood up for those who were being oppressed and those kinds of things, and he rides off alone into the sunset. That mindset really has impacted us in our culture, and to a degree at times that is spiritually unhealthy, because God did not design us, and he did not design his church and his faith to be tackled alone. And that's one of another thing that in our present circumstance that I think we have to be aware of and recognize. We for a number of weeks have worshipped in our homes via video. We've watched it online, and there are some things about that are incredibly convenient to be able to do that. Our Sunday schedules have all of a sudden become much freer than they were before, in that there are not all of those things through the day that we have been doing that are now a part of that schedule. And here's something that I've heard, a concern that I've heard expressed on more than one occasion, and that is that there are going to be people who have become accustomed to the worshiping online and not assembling together. And there might be a tendency on the part of some to say, well, I kind of like it this way, and I'm getting church sitting on my couch. So why should I have to go anywhere at a specific time to do that? Well, if we get to that point of thinking that way, I think that's going to be a tool that Satan is going to use against the church, because it is God's design that we be together, that we're striving side by side. There's a quote that Everett Ferguson, a great book, in my opinion, a very useful book, called The Church of Christ and a Biblical Ecclesiology for Today. Some fancy words there in the title. But anyway, in his discussion of the assembly of the church, he makes this observation. If one can sustain one's faith without the support of common worship, that is, without coming together to be a part of the assembly, to be together side by side with other Christians, if one can sustain one's faith without the support of common worship, then it is not the Christian faith that is held. It is God's design that his church assemble together. And so when we reach the conclusion that I can live out my faith and not assemble together with the church, then what I am practicing is not the faith of the Bible. It's not the faith that God intends for us to have. And so when Paul's encouraging these Christians to behave this way, to have this manner of life that is worthy of the gospel, that's going to include striving side by side for the faith of the gospel, that our striving is for the gospel, and not be frightened in anything by your opponents. There we go. Explicitly said, you have opponents, and Paul knows they have opponents, and that you not be frightened by them. Now, what in the world would they have to be frightened of? Well, this persecution that Paul had received is now being directed toward these Christians. And I want you to think that there are a number of ways in which their being Christians would have devastating effects in many areas of their lives. Socially, they are not engaging in the things that others are engaging in, because now they're Christians, and so they don't do those kinds of things anymore. Sometimes their profession, and professions oftentimes were in terms of a trade that you had, and in order to practice your trade, you had to be a part of a trade guild. And being a part of a trade guild, you were part of this organization. And one of the features of trade guilds in the Roman Empire was that they kind of had their own deities. They had a deity that was theirs, and they participated together in the worship of that deity. And so if you as a Christian were not going to be willing to bow before any deity but God himself, then that had an impact on your being able to have a job and to produce an income. What if, as very well may be the case, that you were a servant or a slave in Rome, and many people believe that the church at Philippi had a very high percentage of servants and slaves that were members of this church. Well, you're a part of this household, and the master of that household is an ardent supporter. He's a religious man. He's an ardent supporter of the deities or a deity or whatever. And so he's going to lead his household into this. Think about Cornelius. When Peter finally came to the house of Cornelius, he had gathered all of his household. In a household in the first century was not just family. It included family and extended family, but it also included everybody that was associated with that house and the functioning of that house. So it included all the servants as well. Cornelius made sure that his whole household was gathered together to hear the words that Peter had to say. That would have been a common practice, that the head of the household would have influenced those under his he would have influenced those under his control in a certain direction, even religiously and spiritually. So you're a citizen, you are a servant, and you're following Jesus Christ, but the master in the household in which you serve is worshiping some false deity. and you say, I can't do that, well, you could be in huge trouble. You see, there are threats that could be brought against these Christians very, very readily, very quickly. But Paul is don't be afraid of those things. Don't be afraid of that. As you're living worthily of the gospel of Christ, that you not be frightened. There is an aspect of that term here that you'll find in some translations that is intimidated. Don't be intimidated by them. They may be the people in power. They may be the ones under whose authority you operate, but don't be intimidated by them. And then he makes this statement. This is a clear sign to them of their destruction, but of your salvation, and that from God. This is a clear sign. Well, what's a clear sign? Well, it's a clear sign in terms of your orientation or your relationship with the gospel. If you are striving for the gospel, if you are working to behave yourself in a way that is in line with the gospel of Jesus Christ, if you are doing those things, yes, that is a clear sign of your salvation. The end result for you is going to be a very positive one. But if you are one who is in opposition to that, you know where that road is headed. That's why this is a clear sign. It's a clear sign from God. And Paul wanted these people to remember that and to know that, to have that at the forefront of their mind and their thinking. Because if you are in an adversarial circumstance where you have people opposing you, just those immediate things can begin to have a big impact on the way you think and the way you feel and the way you act. Paul says, I want you to keep this in mind, that your salvation or destruction is determined by what you're doing right now to a large extent. It's a clear sign of where you're headed and what the ultimate outcome is going to be for you. So be faithful. Maintain, stand firm, strive together, be of one spirit and of one mind, and don't be frightened. For it has been granted to you, he continues, that for the sake of Christ you should not only believe in him, but also suffer for his sake. Now, hang on a second. Let's read that again. For it has been granted to you. This is a term, it has been freely given to you. This is a word that from this same source or the same root comes the very idea of grace. It has been freely given to you, it's been granted to you, that for the sake of Christ, that you would believe in him. The fact that we have the opportunity to believe in Jesus Christ is just such an amazing and incredible thing. And we say, Amen, Paul. Amen, Paul. But he said there are two things here. That you not only believe in him, but also that you suffer for his sake. Whoa, Paul, wait a minute. Really? God has granted us two things in relationship to greet Jesus Christ. That we should believe in him and that we should suffer for him and with him. Man, now you talk about, again, Paul is making these statements that you think, where did that come from? The mind of Christ. To think in terms of Jesus and how Jesus thought. And when we get into chapter 2, he's going to explicitly talk about the mind of Christ and what that led Jesus to do, which included to willingly suffer. And so we have the opportunity, as Paul would say it here, we have the privilege, it's been granted to us to be able to suffer with Christ and for Christ. He followed that path, and I'm honored to be able to follow in the path with him. Now that is so radically different than how we typically think about things like suffering. Excuse me. Suffering is something that we just want to eliminate. Just get it away. We don't want it. We want to separate ourselves from it. We don't like it. And that's a natural thing. But we have to think about it as a Christian in terms of the mind of Jesus Christ. And that we can suffer with Christ. Paul, we're going to come back to this in this study. Paul has a theology of suffering. The way we look at and think about suffering as a Christian is huge, and it's huge in the book of Philippians. So it's been granted to you that you believe in him and that you suffer for his sake, engaged in the same conflict that you saw I had. You witnessed this in me, Paul said, and now you know that I still have it, and I'm encouraging you to stand firm in this together as well. And so, let your behavior, your manner of life, behave as a citizen. Let it be worthy of the gospel of Jesus Christ. We'll look forward to our next study. And in that study, we're going to begin in chapter 2. And we're going to look at the first 11 verses of chapter 2. And this is some very familiar territory for us. That in the terms of we've heard this many, many times. It's powerful. And we look forward to being a part of that study together. Hope to see you then.